something to, let me know when you're ready to type it in. TERRAKUSIN tiltalliance.org. It's Terry who signed in, so.
Did you figure it out?
I just gave him Terry's email address, and hopefully she's okay with me receiving an email on this computer. Okay. And then I could just add it to the PowerPoint. But that's what you want, right? You're trying to get something on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, some visuals.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to take a evaluation for later? Sorry.
I might like talk to Dawn and Kevin and see if she shows up.
Right, our hands are so dry now. My hands are no help.
No. I don't know, Tomas, there's no video in what you're sending, is there?
No.
Okay.
Have you sent it yet?
No, sorry.
Okay. No worries. I just am like, did I miss it? Um. Is it just going to be like one slide or multiple slides?
I have a slideshow that I had prepared for
Oh,
a
cool.
different place.
Is it in PowerPoint?
It is.
Okay, awesome. Then I'll just leave this here and then hopefully it'll just work. Do you feel comfortable using this computer?
Okay,
Standing
yeah.
here, just like clicking through?
Absolutely.
Be here and all.
Are you gonna go?
It is what it is. Should I sit over there? Shall I talk about?
Hello.
Hi.
Are you the replacement for the other person?
Yeah, I'm the Baird part of very beginning, but Nora's the smarter part of Baird about him.
Right.
But I can tell my story, and she's gonna come a little later. We show.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Well, I'll add your name then.
I mean, I have some things to say on farm labor. Because I've been one, and I've also employed them.
Jim Baird.
Jim Baird.
I'm Daniela.
Daniela.
I work for Till.
Okay.
Thanks for being here, everybody. I'm gonna start start in just a few minutes. I'm Daniela, I'm your moderator, and we have Tomas and Jim to be giving us like a introspective history lesson, hopes of the future. How can we change things, both in hope and in reality?
Great. This is done. Till.
Do you want me to give you the email again?
No, I saved it.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize, folks. We were going to have Edgar Franks from the Familias Unidas por la Justicia present, but as you know, in Burlington and in Skagit and in Whatcom County, there was flooding this last week.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we lost another farm worker life to that incident, and he's out there supporting some of the families that have been displaced by the flooding. And so, even though my name was on the presentation, I got a call earlier this week letting me know that I would be representing. My name is Tomas Madrigal. I've worked with community development since about its forming, 2006. I knew Rosalinda Guillen, its founder, since about 1994. Around that time, I was actually also a farm worker at Brochi Orchards, which is known for its fruits in eastern Washington. And so I will walk you through some of the history. I've presented this material before in California, but I think it would be good for us here in Washington to kind of get an idea of how, even though like technology and the world changes, the conditions for a lot of farm workers continue to be the same. A lot of the same issues. I was just getting interviewed yesterday by Molly from, she's a PhD candidate at Washington State University, was doing a project on, do I need the mic? I apologize.
Maybe for the recording.
Great. She was doing a project on wildfire smoke and heat among farm worker, agricultural workers. And so in that interview, I was reflecting to her a lot of the things that I encountered when I was in the field due to early entry, due to heat back in the early 90s, were some of the same issues that these farm workers that I encountered as part of community development's work were facing as well. And so in 2013, Familias Unidas por la Justicia was able to begin a organizing campaign for a farm worker union. And so I and Edgar, who is going to be here as well, were some of the key organizers that were there supporting about 500 farm workers that decided to form that union to develop their political formation to be able to run their own union for themselves. And so it's from that perspective of like knowing what's wrong and living what was wrong to actually creating a way in which we improve the conditions for workers in a local setting that chose to fight for themselves. But as we'll hear from your colleague later, some of the legislative, or not just legislative, but also legal struggles that have extended, for example, the right to have overtime pay, the right to have paid rest breaks. All of those things were fought by these farm workers as well. And those lawsuits extended Washington's ability to protect farm worker rights outside of that local group of 500 farm workers in Burlington to the rest of the state. And so today I'll get to share a little bit with you about what that was like, share some historical reference for you so that you can see just how deep the roots are in terms of these similar struggles, how things are the same, how some of the solutions that we've come up with follow that tradition, but also as I'll share how farm workers are innovating and creating new responses to old problems. And so thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming through, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself and share, and then depending on what you'd like to do, if you'd like to continue or if you'd like to break back to me, I'll have a PowerPoint ready at some point.
Okay, let me introduce myself.
That sounds good.
So hello, I'm Jim Baird, and I think I'll just tell my story a little bit. Nora Sanchez works for my organization as far as our human relations person. I run a 300-acre orchard in the Columbia Basin area, and we have about 50 or 60 employees there. And a little bit of my history is I've been farming about 45 years, strong 40 years anyway, somewhere in there, in the Columbia Basin, the Royal City area. On my mother's side, I go back 4 generations, mid-1800s, and yes, on indigenous people's lands, but that's my story. But on my father's side, they came from Oklahoma. My father's family came from Oklahoma after the Dust Bowl. That family picked fruit in California and then in Oregon and then ended up in Washington, where my father then went on to school, became a lawyer, and did different things. But on my mom's side, the story is kind of interesting because they came from 2 or 3 generations of apple growers, and my mother's family didn't want her to marry an Okie. Did not want to. Anyway, we've had farmland since then, and all the fruit back in the 40s and 50s was picked by people from Oklahoma and Arizona. And then in the last 40 some years, there's been the migration of Hispanic people, primarily from Mexico, working the fields. And I have employed people for 30 or so years. And back in those days, there was undocumented. It wasn't necessarily legal, but we needed the amount of people during apple harvest. And I say things like this, like I knew they had fake green cards, they knew we had fake green cards, the government knew they had fake green cards. It was not, that was the system, and unfortunately that was how agriculture work got done. And my farm, maybe 10 or more years ago, decided to embrace the H-2A worker program. And we now bring in around 50 people, more or less, on any given year. I do have full-time employees that are people that live and work in the greater Othello, Moses Lake, Royal City area of my farms. But we also, and Nora can speak to that more, she's just running a little bit late. And this is a program where they have legal passports, I'm required to have housing for them, they get a guaranteed wage and a guaranteed number of hours per week, per month. We pay their transportation in and out, and anyway, this is a system that I've used for the last 8 or 10 years or so. At that time, domestic laborers are also that higher labor wage we pay. They're matched at that point in time. And there are pros and cons to this program. So, but anyway, that's some of my family's history and my farming, orcharding history.
Wonderful.
That's where we're coming from.
Great. So my background, beyond like growing up as a farm worker, as part of migrant farm worker families, I actually studied agriculture, industrial agriculture and Mexican labor within. And so my dissertation at the University of California in Santa Barbara was on that topic, and I took it from a cultural anthropology lens. The first farm that I was studying, of course, was the one that I grew up on. And what I was trying to figure out was, what was it about that farm that had all the conditions that were ripe to form a farm worker union, that those workers were not able to coalesce and engage in self-determination. Lo and behold, when I was about to file my dissertation in 2012, this other farm worker struggle began to happen in Burlington. And so in 2013, in about the opening of the strawberry season, these were strawberry and blueberry and blackberry pickers. Most of them were indigenous Mexicans from the Oaxaca region of Mexico, Mixteco and Triqui-speaking populations. And they had been migrating into the area for quite a bit since about, I was able to clock in the documentation about since 1994 was when the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed. And that made their ability to live sustainably off of their own cultivations impossible, because U.S. corn flooded Mexican markets, and they couldn't get a good price for the corn that they were cultivating ancestrally in Mexico. And so that was the start of a lot of people's migration stories, first within Mexico, from Oaxaca to Sinaloa to Baja California Sur, in Jalisco. And then from there, from that vantage point, I was able to document one of the farm worker leaders, Filimon Pineda, was actually, I guess, trafficked. Slavery existed with it in the early 2000s. And this contractor in Florida, under lock and key, brought him from Baja California to Florida's tomato fields and Georgia's tomato fields. And they went up and down the East Coast harvesting beef tomatoes and other vegetables. Under lock and key, there was armed guard at the door. And then at the end of their work, they sent them back. And what was really sad for Felimon's story was that he felt that that was the one time that he was able to make the most money under that contract, because even though they deducted all of the expenses, he didn't go anywhere while he was working. And so they paid him at the end, and that was the bulk sum. He used that money to pay for his wedding. He used it to be able to bring his family into California. And so it's really sad. But all of these farm workers that formed Familias Unidas por la Justicia were embedded in several different types of the organization of production, agriculture production, even some that were illegal, like that slavery piece, that human trafficking piece. And I am happy to be able to report to you that that case in Florida was a custom that was legally blocked, right? There was some legal action that happened in Florida that prevented that from happening past the early 2000s. And so it's probably shocking that it still existed, and I'm sad to inform you that it's still very much a system that informs the way that we treat agricultural labor, especially through state-sanctioned trafficking, which is the H-2A program that our colleague here pronounced. There are protections that are supposed to be in place to prevent people from abusing this structure that was designed as an emergency if there was a true labor shortage. And unfortunately, as the years passed from the passage of the Immigration and Customs Reform, that fail-safe became less and less of a thing, to the point where in 2020, when the Trump administration decided that they were going to reverse course on allowing H-2A workers to come into the United States because of the COVID-19 pandemic, they actually threw out the window, through a state of exception, all of the rules that were designed federally to protect workers from being abused. And so from 2020, 2021, and then it's now extended into 2022, H-2A laborers are not even going through the regular process, the stringent process that's meant to protect their safety, right? And it's because of a state of exception. We're in a crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so moving human beings in this way has become, I guess, 21st century slaving, right? It's not, there's no nicer word for it. And the problem is that it's federally sanctioned, it's legal, right? And so just like slavery was legal, just like these other types of items that the farm workers came across were legal, such as being denied overtime, being denied the labor acts that were introduced in the 1930s. All of it was legal because they were accepted from that structure. And so, as you'll hear from our colleague that has the legal strategy when she comes in, some of the wins that were made for farm workers here in Washington in particular have been in establishing those protections, extending those to agricultural workers as well, just like industrial workers. And so I'm going to leave that work for them. But for us, right, so this is what it looks like. We're struggling against something that's legal, but it's still oppressive, right? And so what do workers do, right? And so I think this is ready now.
Yes.
And so I'll go ahead and share with you some of those struggles and some of that history, right? And so from the very beginning of the formation of struggle that was independent here in the United States for farm workers, many of you have been familiar with the United Farm Workers. And so Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were able to form a type of union because they saw all of these same injustices in the fields that I just described, but that people were dealing with, right? And so what I want to focus on is that the UFW's organizing committee's entry into pesticides had to do with worker safety from 1965 to about 1971. They led a sophisticated campaign against pesticides that was waged on several fronts through courts, boycotts, contracts, and legislature. Their objective was unionization in order to provide better wages, security, and working conditions, as well as to ensure health and safety of field workers through a union contract. So this is very important for us to think about, because this is the vanguard of why people form unions and the hope behind forming unions, because absent of a federal, of a state, of a local protection for farm workers, they think that they'll be able to advocate one-on-one with their employer to have these protections in place through a legally defendable union contract, right? And so this is the standard. In 1994, Rosalinda Guillen, the founder of my organization, was the main organizer that was a part of the Chateau Saint Michel campaign. This was a United Farm Workers campaign. They decided to connect with the United Farm Workers AFL-CIO. And in a recent conversation I had with Ian about this campaign, she said health and safety was one of the main reasons the workers organized. That and sexual harassment, but the pesticides were the biggest issue. Some of the workers were having low birth weights and frail babies. Protection from the pesticide was huge in the contract. You could actually see the difference in the children of some of these families. This is the campaign that I began my description in. It's the one that I was on the ground with, the Sakuma Brothers organizing campaign, where over 200 farm workers observed their first of about 7 work stoppages during the 2013 harvest season. Many of the demands that were presented by this group of workers had to do with health and safety, namely being allowed to take sick leave without a doctor's note, better living conditions, and childcare for their children. In 2020, there was another unionization campaign that occurred here in Washington that we were involved in, and that was the Allen Brothers fruit campaign in Yakima area, so Natchez, Yakima area. And what this struggle, as you can see in her shirt, Seguridad de Salud, means safety and health. That was their mantra. That was what they were also struggling for, is that they didn't feel that their employer was doing sufficient amount of work to protect their health. And so these women were able to form a union called Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia. And that first union contract campaign was really difficult. They actually had a vote, but because of all of the intimidation that was going on from the employer, the Labor Relations Board had to intervene and overturn that and give them the opportunity to do so without any kind of intimidation from the employer. And so we're in the process of them being able to have their union, right? And so this slide, I think, is important because it shows some of the long-term goals that were being made way back in 1962, right? So they were thinking about having financial justice. They were thinking of having life insurance, mutual aid, right? They were thinking of providing services and cooperatives, right? And they wanted a year to be able to plan a general strike that included a lot more farm workers. Here in Washington, in 1967 to 1977, this same dream was found fertile ground in the formation of the United Farm Workers Co-op with Tomas Villanueva here, right? And this co-op had the same imaginary because Tomas had actually gone as a union organizer for the United Farm Workers during the earlier campaigns. And what he came back with was that he had to establish what was being moved in California in the place that he grew up in, which was Washington State. And so this is part of that legacy that we have that I'm trying to narrate. At Community Development, the place that I work, or the place that I am a volunteer food systems researcher for, cooperative development is something that we've continued in that legacy, right? And so here are some examples of some of the earlier cooperatives that existed. Cooperativa Jacal was the first cooperative farm worker-owned farm that we were able to launch. That's now its own industrial effort, but it's owned by the farm workers, and it's no longer a cooperative, but it gave them entry into the field, right? And what was really essential is that Rosalinda Guillen, after winning that contract for the United Farm Workers at Chateau Saint Michel, was recruited up to the United Farm Workers as a vice president And it was in that context there in California that she was invited to the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2002. And it was in Brazil that she was able to remember what the value of a cooperative economy, cooperative solidarity economy is. And it's within that global context that she was able to say, you know what, the work that we're doing just focusing on specific contracts isn't enough. We have to imagine what's the future. And so these cooperative developments that we've done are an example in real life of that vision of what can be possible. Familias Unidas por la Justicia, that same farm worker union, was also not satisfied enough with having a contract at Sakuma Brothers Farms, their employer. Right? They wanted to be autonomous and to be able to reintroduce their people into the ability to cultivate for their own well-being, for their own self-sustenance. The Cooperativa Tierra y Libertad is on 60 acres of land. 40 acres of that are in production for market. And the other rest of the acres are being in development for what they call a mini ejido project, which is basically it's not just land and for farm production for market. It's also land for living on and for producing self-sustenance, right? And so the farm workers of Familias Unidas por la Justicia, who are owners of Cooperativa Tierra y Libertad, are modeling from their own experience in Oaxaca of these ejidos in Mexico, which were dismantled in about the 70s, 80s, but a lot of their communal property was held in that format since the revolution, are bringing that model here to the United States. And so the piece that you talked about, the relationship with indigenous land, is that these farm workers are indigenous diaspora. And I'm just, in January, I'll be publishing a piece in the Journal for Agrarian Change. And that was one of the questions that they asked, is like, these are diasporic people, they're indigenous people, but what about the indigenous people on whose land they are on, right? And so that made me think a lot about like the relationship between the folks. The original place that we wanted to have the cooperative was in collaboration with the Swinomish tribe, right? And so we were in talks with them. It didn't pan out. This other avenue panned out later on. And Nick Estes, who was one of the authors of The Red Deal, it's a book that y'all can reference, has 2 pages of discussion about what they mean by land back. And the very same thing that Emiliano Zapata said in the Mexican Revolution is what this group of indigenous people are saying, is that those who cultivate the land and live on the land that aren't doing so for like a corporation or something, they have a say in how that land is stewarded. And so the key piece is the relationship that you have in stewarding the land that's there, and the relationship that you have with the original indigenous people of that area. And the reason that this is so important, this is not in the book, this is my analysis, is that the land, even the land that we're on, is made up of the remains. It's a sacred site. It's where people's being, like your body as human beings readjusts itself every 7 years. And so every cell of your body, every organ is reorganized, right, every 7 years. So imagine how much of that is being left, right? And so if we're thinking time immemorial, indigenous people that lived on this land are important to be acknowledged, not because you're saying that they own the land, but because they are the land, right? And this is a concept that indigenous people in diaspora know very well. And so on Cooperativa Tierra y Libertad, the types of ceremony and ritual that go into thanking the land for the production, for harvest, are very complex, and they're not open to public eyes, right? And that's the direct relationship with those ancestors, but also like working with the folks in the nearby Lummi Reservation, Jewel James, for example, are key pieces of trying to advance and trying to move. And the piece that, going back to Nick Estes, the piece that he was framing was that a just transition is not possible without tribal sovereignty, right? And so, and this is why, right? And so this is their relationship with the land that they're cultivating. So, jumping back to the 1970s in Granger, Washington, there was the formation of La Escuelita, and Radio KDNA is still located in the same vicinity of where the original one was, which is now gone. But one of the first things that they were able to do in Granger was to get farm workers to provide their own health. And so the first farm worker health center was established there in Toppenish. And it was created through a community engagement process. And so some of the community health workers that you see here are not professional clinicians. They're actually community health workers that are teaching sanitary issues and also teaching how to take your blood pressure, how to keep your teeth clean. This model is another model that community development has developed, and thank God, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that's allowed a rapid response to community health needs, right? And so the promotoras de salud aren't just community health workers, they aren't just promotoras de salud, but they're organizers, right? So they're not just providing basic needs to people, they're organizing people to make them more capable of defending themselves, right? And this relationship where you're not providing basic needs as a charity, but you're providing solidarity and helping people to understand that you're there struggling with them, is what allows for mutual aid to exist, right? And so these are some examples in 2019 of some of the mutual aid that was occurring from Familias Unidas por la Justicia in supporting the basic needs of their community, but it was also like reciprocal. It wasn't one way, right? It wasn't treating food as a commodity. So this piece, I think, was specific to the other conference. It's more of a dig to the UFW at the present. And this piece was showing the importance of Tomas Villanueva. He also ran for Congress. He's passed away. But some of these pieces, in terms of like why it's important to have a vision, is to remind folks that these are techniques that we've used to struggle and that have been really successful, right? And there are a couple asks that I was asked to bring up. This link here, you can find it on our website at foodjustice.org. But right now, because of the flooding that just happened, there's a tremendous need for solidarity and mutual aid support. If you and not just money, but if you're interested in providing support for people getting housing, or support for people accessing resources, or getting basic needs like clothes or something like that, that's all a possibility. And so our promotoras de salud are directly connected to the community, and this is the way that you would be able to connect with us so that we're all working together. And they wanted us to remind you of that. And then the other piece that we've been working on legislatively, I guess we're not legislatively, it was governmentally, is no, as I discussed at the beginning, the state of legal protections, of governmental protections for farm workers is way behind, and it's very similar to how it used to be. And so part of that accountability process is trying to increase the ceiling, but also the floor of where folks are. And so in regards to climate change issues like wildfire smoke, like heat exhaustion, and now flooding, right? There's been a call by a coalition of communities, including the United Farm Workers, PICUN, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, Community Development, and all of these groups that are working together to ask the governors of Washington, Oregon, and California to have structured laws, because these migrant workers, they still migrate. And so they might live in Madera and they might live in the Santa Maria Valley, but they migrate every year to the strawberry harvest in Hillsborough, Oregon, and in Skagit County here in Washington. And so that reality means that they're basically arguing is that there needs to be like a set of rules along that migrant stream that's the same, so that they're not confused every place that they go. And what our hopes is that the levels that are set are going to be the highest ones, the highest standards that are available in terms of the trigger points for temperature, in terms of the use of the requirement of use of face masks, right? And it's in these relationships that we're able to make a new world. And so I'm not sure that this is accepting sign-ons anymore. I think the 19th, which was yesterday, was the last day, but they wanted me to bring your attention to it. For some reason, you're able to get this piece. You'll be able to pull up the language of the request that's being made. And there's two forms. There's one that's like an executive summary, and there's one that's more technical, speaking to those agencies that are going to enforce this. And so those are some examples of some of the work that we're doing. Thank you so much. I'll let you put the other one back. Oh no, it's on. Wonderful.
Did it. So, well, Nora has not arrived. Jim, I don't know. I expect she's going to be here any minute. We can see if there are questions for Tomas. Unless, are you prepared to?
Can I speak from this one?
Yes, you can.
But also, yeah, I like that idea. Let's have questions for Tomas if there are any. I would like to. I mean, I will speak for Nora's or my own side here as well to offer, I think, a perspective on what we just heard, which was an excellent presentation. But are there some questions?
Yeah, I have a question about like the state of kind of contract negotiations as far as farm worker unions go. So it's my understanding that there's like a lack of coverage in the under like the NLRA for farm workers. So what backs up those contracts when they're settled, like legally?
So it was really essential for Rosalinda to have been involved in that early campaign in 1994 that I put up on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was in that campaign, which was against Big Tobacco, actually was the owner of those wineries, that they were able to argue that Washington's Little Norris LaGuardia Act covers agricultural workers.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a bill that was created way back when, at the same time that roughly that the National Labor Relations Act was made, and it had language that was a little bit more flexible, and so they were able to get their contracts recognized under that structure, because the language in that bill here in Washington allows for any group of workers to be able to have the freedom to organize themselves. And so that little Norris, it was a legal maneuver, right? But it was finding that gem there that was never used in this way in 1994, right? And in 1995, that contract went into place. And so by the time that there was another group of farm workers that were willing to fight, because this was a 4-year struggle, that once that contract was in place, it was defendable legally.
And are most of these unions being formed and by the rank and file and then maintained as like an independent organization, or is there like?
No, this is part of that innovation. Traditional unions had the same mentality that it was going to be an outside group that was organizing someone. Even here in Washington, there was a couple of like I guess traditional unions that were wanting to organize agriculture workers that have not met success precisely for that reason. Is because it's really difficult to build rapport from the outside in, and the success that we've seen, even with the Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia that emerged in Yakima, is that it's driven from the workers themselves.
Right.
And that's really essential because there's quite an industry for anti-union efforts to intimidate and to discourage workers from being able to form their own unions. And we saw that that's all documented, for example, in that NLRB complaint against Allen Brothers Farms, which is publicly available. You can read all the different types of intimidation that happened. And it's important to point out that agricultural workers are separate, because agricultural workers that work in a warehouse packing fruit are covered under the National Labor Relations Act, and agriculture workers that work in the field are not covered, or they're exempted from the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. And that is why it was necessary to use the Little Norris-LaGuardia Act in order to get representation for field workers. And so not every struggle results in an actual union. A lot of H2A workers, starting in about 2017, struggled against the conditions that they were experiencing, and most of those resulted in legal settlements or in lawsuits where they won retribution for the ills that they were caused. And it's really important that it's work that's driven from the outside, because it's those outside lawsuits that were from the class of workers themselves that were able to get some kind of response. When left to itself, the government's response, for example, with the Gebbers Farm this last 2020, they had flagrant violations of the state's rules. They were levied like millions of dollars of a fee, and negotiated that down to like being able to improve their company. And so it wasn't really a penalty. It was more like they negotiated it to the cost of business. It was $10,000 for treating people horribly, right? And so that is why workers have felt the need to be able to defend themselves and to stand up for themselves. And in places, I think that E.P. Thompson's work, so he's an English Marxist, and he did quite a bit of work about the moral economy of the working class. And that's kind of the situation that I found myself in the farm that I grew up on. As long as that moral economy was maintained, workers were able to withstand a lot of abuse. And so even though for me that I was a temporary worker, I only worked in the summers, and I was seeing all these horrible things, from my perspective it was horrible, right? But from the worker's perspective is like, hey, you know, if we enter a field early, right after it's been sprayed, that allows us to work in a time where there's a lull in production, right? Because between Descuate, which is thinning, and harvest, there's a little bit of a lull, right? And so that is why some people actually were willing to put themselves at risk, because for them, because they were paid so low, they felt that they needed to be able to have that long-term work,
Right.
and not have their hours cut. And so that was the balancing act, and that's what I frame as the moral economy. Is like, even though it was a bad thing, it didn't change the moral economy. But in the context of the workers that I just described, there was premature deaths,
Mhm.
right? And people, that breaks the moral economy. It says like fuck this. They were ready to burn down Sakuma Brothers Farm because they were so upset about what was happening, right? And so the organizing campaign was rebalancing that moral economy and focusing that towards a union contract, right?
Mhm.
And so even though back then perhaps the owner didn't see the value in this campaign emerging prevented tremendous property loss.
Mhm. Right.
We had another question over here.
Yeah, I have worked with Pukun on like chlorpyrifos and some other issues, and so I'm just curious to get your take on Washington's ag overtime, because you have it here, Oregon doesn't, and it was a big problem. And then at the end of the last legislative session, legislative leadership floated what I found shocking, $150 million employer compensation fund, and even with that, they couldn't get it across the finish line. And it's so sad to hear like this company that has violations only gets charged $10,000, but yet on the other side, when they want to actually have to pay a fair wage, they need to be compensated to the tune of $150 million. But anyway, that aside, just wanted to hear, what it took to get it across the finish line. And we hear a lot of parade of terribles, like the sky is going to fall and we can't afford to do this. How did it really play out in Washington? And then for you, Ms. Jim Baird, how does the interplay with ag overtime work with the H-2A program?
And Tomas, do you mind repeating the question so that we can make sure it's recorded? Because I think it's difficult for the mic to hear the question.
Sure.
Thanks.
So the question was to compare the concessions made in Oregon and Washington around the overtime rules. Washington just won a legal case that allowed farm workers to qualify for overtime protections. Oregon has not been able to do so. And the follow-up question was for Mr. Baird to share a little bit about what that's been like for managing with H-2A workers and overtime. So I'll let you start.
I actually don't know. I wish Nora was here, but I don't know. Well, it's not. What was labor overtime is it 60 hours a week or so this first for 2 years, and it's factored in overtime here. So I don't think on my farm it hasn't affected our overtime this year, and I don't know how state law is going to work with H-2A law. Marcy, did you have a question back there?
Well, it was actually kind of related. I was curious about the changes that were made to H-2A under the pandemic. You said they had made exceptions to the usual protections, and I was curious what those were.
Well,
Go for it.
I'll address that because I thought the exceptions were that they were much more stringent on us as the employers. We had to, we did in our housing put people farther apart. We put more, everybody got obviously face masks, but more hand washing stations, and the amount of regulations over us were increased, and that's fine. We wanted to keep everybody healthy. I want to, I think it's been very good. I really am I would like to take a little bit of a different side of this story, and that is from the employer side. Is you've got to remember, first of all, especially in tree fruit or most of the fruit we're talking here, our single most important thing in that is our labor. And treating labor well, which includes paying them as well as we can, housing if that's appropriate, is good business. It's good, and so, and in my area, I'm in the Columbia Basin where we have large commercial farms, orchards, potato farms, onion farms, large commercial farms. I don't see this kind of abuse. I guess I'm primarily in the H2A or in workers in general. I agree with you on NAFTA. It caused a lot more people coming into our area. But now in Othello and Quincy and Royal City, Moses Lake, our populations are a very strong percentage of Hispanic, and these people, this group has assimilated into our society. And so back into the farm, I don't see the abuse. We're heavily regulated with inspections, and primarily as it relates to H2A. The housing requirements we have are stringent and are tight, and these are pretty good housing. So I didn't see, there were tougher regulations when COVID. I didn't see anything letting go. I mean, I have no idea what that might be about. If anything, our regulations got tougher because for all of us did, right? We're all in these things. We're all washing our hands. Mm-hmm. You say what?
Yeah. So I think the problem here is perspective, right? And so in the H2A program was created from a federal law that had to do with immigration, right? And in order to close the border to people from migrating back and forth, one of the requirements that was lobbied was to have a fail-safe that extended what used to be the Bracero program in the form of an H2A visa. And so if there was a labor shortage, employers could request guest laborers that got a special visa if they followed a couple of rules. And that rule was that they paid them an adverse effect wage rate, which was higher than the minimum wage, because they didn't want to subvert the wages of domestic workers for using H2A workers. They didn't want H2A workers to replace workers that were domestic. And two, another piece, for example, is you can't bring H2A workers to replace workers that are on strike. And so that happened with Familias Unidas por la Justicia in Burlington. And they were able to convince that they had enough domestic workers that were part of the union that were willing to work, and that the only reason they were bringing H2A workers was to try to suppress that labor. And so that's a specific employer example. But there's federal regulations, and those are very lax. And so
How so?
So the way that they're enforced, it's the Department of Labor and the Department of State, the USCIS, and I believe the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, are all different entities that are supposed to enforce the rules federally. And so when I was saying that there's a state of exemption, that state of exemption is federal. So in the United States of America, since 2020, there's been an exemption, and that was a total flip, because originally the Trump administration wanted to just block any kind of visa, including H2A, H1B, you name it, right? Any kind of entry of immigrants into the United States. And because of lobbying federally, they made it a state of exception. And what that did is that they extended the amount of countries that can participate in the program, and they rescinded all of the requirements to do interviews with every single person that was going to come. That was a requirement federally. in order to come into the H-2A program. And so that's a federal process. In Washington State, because of our litigation and our work within the legislature, we were able to get our Employment Security Department, which is a internal Washington cabinet agency, to be required to oversee the rules that were established federally, because they weren't being there wasn't evidence that showed that they were being respected on a federal level. So in Washington State, the Agricultural Seasonal Worker Advisory Committee was created by law in Washington to oversee the H-2A program here in Washington. And the biggest problem there wasn't folks like yourself, it was the Washington Farm Labor Association that was abusing the way in which H-2A workers were being brought into the state. And that was a nonprofit organization that was funded by the Farm Bureau in order to basically bring the number of H-2A workers way high, exponentially high. And you can see these numbers in the Department of Labor's data. And so what you're describing is all the regulations that came out of COVID-19's response. So the governor issued executive orders or governor's proclamations that required the Secretary of Health to provide rules around farm worker housing in particular, and around reporting of outbreaks. And so those are the rules that you're saying were stringent in terms of requiring like no bunk beds to be used. And that was something that we were all involved in debating, and there was lawsuits that were involved from both the grower advocate side and from the farm worker advocate side in order to get the government to have rules that were either stringent enough or to have rules that were not limiting the type of capital that farm owners were able to make. And so just explaining that that's the reality of Washington State, and it's unique.
So I can't necessarily compete on all of the laws and everything that you're very articulate and understand real well. I guess I just look at it from our farming standpoint, is that, or let's look at the H-2A program in general. I wasn't sure it's helpful to call it slavery or like slavery. That's kind of something that I'm not sure that helps the conversation there. I find that pretty offensive actually, because I feel like labor is, I said how important it is. I want to say that I don't see that kind of abuses, and I primarily get people from Guerrero or Michoacan. I personally have lived in Mexico for years. I mean, we're in a relationship with our labor here, and I feel of the people that come back, they have come back almost every year. I've got people almost every year for 5, 6, 7 years now. They come up here, they're young men, they take back, they work hard, they're housed and taken care of well. We take them to the clinic when they're sick. This is all, and this is what I see other of my farms do in this area. And abuses, I just don't see this abuse. They take their money back to Mexico. They're prescribed here for a certain amount of time. It's a contract that we have a lot of involvement in putting together. I struggle with seeing how it is. We're very careful about making sure that the domestic labor are not displaced by that. That's an important aspect of how the H-2A program is tried to run. The way agriculture has evolved in Washington State and the apple growing, the wine grape growing region, we've exponentially and increase the amount of labor that we've needed, and that's what the call for the labor has been. So that's some of how my side is seeing some of this story here. Are there some comment or questions to that?
If anyone else has a comment.
Go over there.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, it seems like your experience is really specific to your, you know, your operation, and that's really, it's really an important perspective, and I think that what is being expressed by Tomas is much more systemic and much more about larger systems, and it is,
I'll agree with
you know, that term slavery is accurate for a lot of people's experiences, right? It's not necessarily talking specifically about, you know, you and your operation, but I think that there needs to be a lot of space right now given to the experiences of other people, and not necessarily taking it on yourself personally as we're talking about this, and just to say that there's a larger conversation to be had around like how this system, you know, even in the best case scenario on your farm, right, or like one of the really good scenarios on your farm is set up in a way that still talks about people as labor, right, and talks about human beings and individuals as a commodity that can be manipulated and exchanged. And I think that just to put that out there, that like I'm seeing you kind of struggle right now and maybe take it on a little bit personally, but I think that there's two really important pieces here that are happening, at least two, right? Probably many, but just to acknowledge that there needs to be space for many different perspectives here. So, and that the things that Tomas is talking about are really true and applicable for a lot of people, and it's yeah, just wanted to name that and put that out there.
Thank you. That was good. That was good. Melissa?
I just wanted to acknowledge that comment. I think, in, you know, all due respect, I think we also, it's really important to stay away from talking about sides in this conversation. I think that when we have this conversation and think of it as one side versus another, I think we need to understand that we are in this together, and that we need to figure out, it is, you know, farm labor is an integral part of the farm. It is a unit. It is together that owners and operators and farm labor make it work. And if we're always thinking about it in terms of two sides, it's very difficult. I did have a question for you though, Tomas, actually. Something really interesting came up in the roundtable conversation about farm labor that we had yesterday, where they talked about how in particular, you know, we relied much more on undocumented labor historically, and until the H-2A visa program really sort of ramped up and we started being able to bring in much more labor under the H-2A visa program. And it was brought up that has had an impact on really leaving behind potentially domestic as well as undocumented labor that's being paid minimum wage, but aren't being offered many of the amenities, I'll call them amenities, right? The housing and some of the other, and healthcare that the H-2A visa workers are being offered. And how do we deal with that issue where actually the H-2A visa program is perhaps contributing to some inequities in terms of the labor market for farms?
Yeah, I don't think that it's contributing to inequities. I think the inequities are there, and they're being multiplied by the crisis. And there is a scholar from the 50s that framed it as formalization and informalization of the harvest labor market. And so the Bracero program was a formalization of the harvest labor market. After the Bracero program, like around 1965-ish, until about 1986, there was an informalization of the harvest labor market, right? And that's when, like, a lot of, until 1986, when there was an amnesty that extended citizenship to agricultural workers in the United States. There was people that were being exploited because they were undocumented. And so after 1986 was when those immigration reforms came in, and that reiterated what in 1965 had come out as a Immigration Control Act kind of piece that introduced the H-2A visa. And it was in 1986 when that happened that there was what we would call a formalization of the harvest labor market through the H-2A program. And it wasn't really used much until the border was successfully closed. That was about 1992. And so from 1992 till about 2006, you see a lot of strife among immigrant workers. And in 2006 was when the massive immigrant rights marches happened in Chicago and LA and Seattle and New York. And that was like about that. The other thing that happened is in 2001, the Patriot Act really changed a lot of the ways in which immigration laws were enforced. And so, though the border was closed officially like in 1992, and you can read this in Joseph Nevin's essays, but in 2001, when right after 2001, when the Patriot Act was formed, that kind of sealed the border for sure. And so a lot of the domestic workers, a lot of the farm workers that I'm talking to you about were stuck on this side of the border. It became inflated the price that people had to pay in order to cross into the United States. It was like $10,000 a person per trip. And just to reiterate, because we're ending, you need to look at settler colonialism and the history of Oregon as a settler colonial state as to why racism is so strong that it doesn't allow for basic needs to be met. And in Washington, the only way that we were able to get around that is through solidarity with other folks to be able to move that. And so that's it. And I believe we're out of time. Right.
We've got just a few minutes. We've got just a few minutes left. So I would love to. If anyone has any comments or if there's any last things that you want to share, especially on like what can we do, you know?
It goes till 3:15, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
I have till 3:10.
Oh, 3:10. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have 4 minutes, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I do like some comments from back there that we are all people working together. Maybe it was you, Melissa. I mean, that's the essence of a lot of this. There is a lot of systemic issues of colonialism and thinking of labor as a commodity and all of that. And we do have to get back to, if you heard the talk today at lunch, we do have to get back to thinking of, in collective forms, and we're all in this together and stuff. And you, I have a comment.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I think part of the opening that I see here is like an invitation to responsibility, and like I see in some of the dynamics in this conversation, like I'm so grateful to your study and you coming to present here, because I learned so much of a history that I want to be responsible to, both as a settler but as someone that does work in this country and is a part of the workforce and a part of also the upper class. And yeah, there's an invitation to responsibility, I think, in knowing the labor history of the place that we are working, spending money, being humans, and there's a responsibility also to land and to I'm thinking of, I can't remember who I want to reference here, but the invitation of even though treaties are these documents that have so much violence associated with them, they're responsibilities they're documents that we're all responsible to. And I think it sounds like you were responsible for responsible to new COVID regulations and stuff, and I wonder if there's ways that by being responsible to all of the laws that affect farming and labor in Washington. Like, there's actually so much to learn here that I think would probably round out the sense of solidarity on the like human to human relationship part of this, because I think I think there's threads in here that we're all thrumming on of like this is actually just about humans being good to each other and people being connected in ways that are really profound and important for a different world. And I think that is just a responsibility thing too, and not saying that you aren't responsible. I'm saying in the way that like it sounds like you have relationships with your workers that you can trust and lean into, and that there's also this labor history, racialized labor history, farm worker history that's so worth knowing to be able to support them even better. And I hope that everyone in Washington, I hope that everyone in the world lives into that and does that on a global scale.
I have a few comments / thoughts. So I'm currently working as a laborer on a smaller organic operation, and at present is currently entirely domestic workers. There's about 12 of us, and and it's a farm that's been undergoing some growth, and so the conversation of starting to employ H2A workers seasonally is opening up. And so I guess some of my observations and concerns about this as we've begun to grow, the kind of organic negotiation that can happen when you're a crew of 5 people with the employer is starting to become more complex as we get different structures on the farm. And then with the thought of the addition of the H2A program, is there are a number of concerns that come to mind when it comes to maintaining solidarity among the workforce when we have these different levels of ability to assume risk as workers in the negotiating process. And this is one of the structural flaws that I see with the H2A program, is that it puts a certain group of workers in say our work environment into a situation where they are tied as far as lodging and transportation goes to the employer, and so that places them in a position of less leverage as compared to the domestic workers who, I have the luxury to, if I, were fed up with something, I have more resources available to me in terms of how I can leverage my ability to, seek other employment or exit the situation I'm in. And I guess so one comment is that's an issue that I see with the H2A program, is that it creates this hurdle that I think as farm workers it's our responsibility to strategize how we can bridge a connection over that, being a domestic worker with any migrant workers that might come in. I think something worth thinking about is how do we navigate that boundary of certain workers being more tied to the decisions of the employer and therefore more at risk. And on the topic of this being something that we all have to do together, both workers and employers, I would say I think that's to a certain extent true, but then I guess also just when it comes down to the material reality of our circumstances as workers, it's me and my employer have different interests fundamentally, and so that is something that I think, even if we have a working relationship, it's important to acknowledge and important to consider when we're thinking of how are certain work programs affecting workers' ability to leverage better protections or better wages within their circumstances. And then on the topic of labor shortage, something that I've come across and maybe have observed is this idea that creating there's a labor shortage we have a hard time finding people domestically to work this season, and so that's part of what opened up the conversation about employing H2A workers. But the rates at which people are being hired on domestically are often lower than the prevailing wage mandated by the H-2A program. And so I wonder sometimes if the control mechanisms that are in place in the H-2A program make it such that that's a more appealing source of labor, and additionally just a high degree of reliability and experience, where as employers may be less willing to pay out better starting wages domestically in order to be able to meet the qualifications of like a labor shortage to use the H-2A program. Just some thought.
It's expensive
Thank
to
you.
do H-2A.
I actually have to ask you guys to continue your conversation
Yeah.
outside of the official session. Thank you all so much for being here and for being so passionately engaged.
Thank
The
you,
next
everybody.
session is starting in 10 minutes. I would love to collect your little slips. Thank you so much. Let's give a little round of applause to our leaders.
No, I know what I don't either. Just poking on a board.
Will you just have it at the front because I have to run to
No,
my
thank
next
you
session.
for stepping up.